Hello, Andrew. Good
Hi
evening.
there.
Thank
Nice
you
to meet
very
you.
much for agreeing for this interview.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and by the way, thank you everybody who's going to watch this interview, and particularly thank you for those who send the questions. And I would like to start with introducing you. I'm going to say a couple of things about you.
Okay.
So Andrew is a teacher trainer with more than 25 years of experience and one of the leading experts on the lexical approach.
Gosh.
And together with Hugh Deller, you co-authored course books Innovations, Outcomes by NGL, and also you have a new course book series called Roadmap by Pearson, and one of the levels of perspectives, a course book for teenagers. Together with Hugh, Andrew also wrote a book teaching lexically, aimed at teachers who would like to implement the lexical approach. And finally, Andrew is a co-founder of the Lexical Lab. It's a training center for teachers of English in London.
That's right.
Yeah, okay, so I would like to start really broadly and to talk about the basics of the lexical approach for those people who don't know much about it. So can you describe the lexical approach in sort of 3 or maybe 5 basic principles?
Yeah. I'll try. Can I just say to start with that I actually I kind of hesitate to talk about being a presenter of the lexical approach or kind of what I do as being the lexical approach, because I think very much our idea is I suppose a kind of principled eclecticism really, and the principles that we're trying to employ are different approaches in the activities in the classroom to some degree are based on ideas in the lexical approach of Michael Lewis and other lexical views of language. And I think that's the key thing. The first kind of basic is to think about that language isn't a set of grammar rules plus words. It's basically it's kind of all meshed in together. And if anything, the grammar patterns that we come to know and sometimes teach are the product of how we use words, not the other way around. So you see then that in the case of when we're using language, that we use a lot of these kind of formulaic phrases, so like chunks of language which we don't process, it seems, from a grammar rule. We just are producing them as a kind of word, if you like, so a string of words which have one meaning. So something as simple as what are you doing tonight? What are you doing tonight could be seen as a lexical chunk rather than as a grammar of present continuous and future meaning with the word do. Okay.
And like a question, sentence, a full sentence.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where the kind of view of language, and then when you take that then into, I mean, that's how I think language develops as a native speaker. It basically comes from our experience of how language is used, and we hear these words and phrases used together all the time, and from that we develop patterns, and as a result we get all these kind of collocations, chunks, phrases, which are not I mean, could be they could be said, say, take the time. What time is it? You know, it's 20 past 8. Well, there's lots of ways to say 20 past 8. We could say it exceeds 8 by 20. But we don't, just because we don't. It's our experience of language which prevents us from doing that. I mean, you could do, you know, if you wanted to, but it just wouldn't be accepted by our community of language, and that's how the language works. So once you take that idea, yes, we as teachers, we want to maybe help the process a bit quicker by, rather than waiting around to experience all these sample chunks and sample patterns, which include our traditional grammar, we want to provide them to our students. We want to kind of show them more and give them a guide to that. So from that point of view, you want to be thinking always about what is it that students say. I mean, what is it that we want to say in life? What are the real exponents that we would say when we're doing those, and starting from that point, rather than necessarily from a grammar. And then maybe the last thing would be, once you break all that down, fundamentally the thing which is more important are words. So, you know, if you're going between words and grammar, although these things are always intertwined, words are more important. They're the things which convey our meanings, and that should be the driving force of our courses and syllabus. And
yeah, so as Michael Lewis said, language is not lexicalized grammar, but
grammaticalized lexis.
Grammaticalized lexis,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And the next question is something that someone who never heard about the lexical approach before can ask. Yeah. So why do you then believe that this is the most effective teaching approach than any others?
Well, as I say, I would hesitate to kind of say there's one kind of single approach which is working for everybody and for everything. So, and, you know, obviously lots of people have been learning languages in all kinds of different ways. So with that caveat, I would say it's better. I mean, if you take, so I've just written a beginner book, Outcomes Beginner. And if you look at the way beginners books, I actually think beginner low levels is the true place where a lexical approach to language is most important. Because if you take the traditional route, essentially what you would have is 4 units on the verb to be, followed by 2 or 3 units on present simple, first statements, then questions, then negatives maybe, then third person, etc. Then we can have our past simple, da-di-da. We go through all that
then
process.
15 lessons later, present continuous, present perfect.
Exactly. And you kind of, exactly. So you go through this process of learning in a very building block way. And by the way, the course will not provide any examples of these of grammar which hasn't been taught. So you won't actually see, in a lot of cases, you won't even see the phrase "I don't know" until we've taught the present simple.
Okay? Negative.
And negative, exactly. And so as a result, you get some rather peculiar conversations because we have to control it to practice it. And we don't learn, for example, present perfect till, I mean, the most mad thing is that it continues. We start again at elementary in the same process, and then we don't get to present perfect until unit 12 of elementary. It's kind of like, you know, potentially 300 hours of teaching down the line. Yet, if we think of the phrase, have you been to, or have you been here? I mean, it's the first, almost one of the first things you get asked, have you been here before? And as a phrase, it's perfectly understandable, very easy to teach. You can translate it, even without translation, to be honest, it's very easy to understand that you can have you been to plus, it's still a pattern, it's still, but it's a lexical pattern rather than grammatical in the same way. So have you been to plus place name? Okay. And we can simply reply to those yes or no. I mean, again, I have a thing about short auxiliaries. I don't see the point of them at low levels. You know, just say yes or no. It's enough. but just on that basis, so we can teach that. What we're not saying is that a student then has mastered the present perfect. What we're saying is they can master that as a phrase. They can make use of it. And they can also see more of these examples. In fact, I mean, I would have more examples of all kinds of grammar in low-level books, not necessarily for students to study or repeat, but at least there as kind of part of a conversation they hear, for example, just, you know, modified, simplified in terms of their level, to enable them to say lots of things, but it's not a dominant thing. So yeah, so that is why I think, so that's one reason why it's better. The second reason, even if you don't believe that this is possible to learn this phrase first, I still think you can see a lexical view, which would be, I would teach just questions which students might actually hear and want to say. So if we're going like present simple questions, what do you do? Where do you work? Do you enjoy it? As a typical kind of part of the conversation. You could teach those as present simple forms of questions. Yeah, I mean, we can analyze it as grammar if you want to. But the point is, for the student who can't get this, which I think is true of a lot of students, they're not kind of mathematical in that way. They could they could just learn them as phrases and get somewhere in their language. You know, they won't become fluent, but most people don't want to become fluent. Most people don't actually ever get anywhere near it. In fact, very, very few do. I mean,
but it can let them to sort of fast track to at least basic communication.
Exactly. It's all to do with enabling, rather than saying that, oh, we can't do this. We can't study this because that grammar is more advanced. We can't have this conversation because they need this grammar, and that is for pre-intermediate. Or we can't have this conversation, they'll get it wrong. To me, that doesn't matter. You know, what's much more important. And I don't know whether this is maybe veering slightly away from anything which is specific to the lexical approach. I mean, this is where perhaps my view would come in, is that, you know, I suppose where it's similar is that I think of, you know, any kind of accuracy comes from exposure over time, and hearing and seeing words or grammar in lots of different contexts over a long period of time. And that's how we develop our accuracy. And so from that point of view, if you accept that, you understand that you won't learn any piece of grammar or any words, how they're used in any one lesson. It's a journey. And at any point we get off that journey and we don't complete it. So, but you know, we want to enable them a little bit more at those lower levels in particular.
Fine. Then the next question is, why, if the lexical approach is really such a good way of helping people to maybe progress a bit better, a bit quicker, yeah. Then there is a question: why has the lexical approach been so long in coming? And that's, by the way, was a name of the title of the article by Leo Sullivan in 2013 in the Guardian.
Yeah.
And well, he argued that over the last 2 decades, there had been more and more scientific evidence in support of the lexical approach, but still, as for 2019, to my best knowledge, there are only 2 coursebook series that fully employ the principles of the lexical approach, which are your innovations and outcomes.
Yeah.
We in Russia love dearly.
Yes. I mean, to be honest, even there, I mean, I wouldn't say they fully take on. I mean, innovations perhaps a little bit more so. But I mean, there are still aspects. I would say actually the outcomes beginner of the outcome series is closest to to a kind of more lexical approach.
Yeah, but the question stays, yeah. So why does it take such a long time?
Because, well, I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, I think I mean, I don't know if it's the same in Russia, but certainly people's perception of language is they think of it in terms of grammar as a kind of in a general way, but they actually don't understand what they mean by grammar. So what I mean by this is, if you look at like on in the general population in the UK, sometimes you'll see people complaining that young people today don't write correctly, You'll see blog posts about poor grammar and how to improve it. But actually, when you look at what they're talking about, it's very rarely that they're talking about grammar, certainly in the way we would as ELT teachers. So they're not talking about tense. They're not talking about, they're not even talking about word order and stuff like that most of the time. It's things like punctuation.
Punctuation, yeah.
Yeah, it'll be things like the misuse of words. So, you know, or sometimes, you know, should it be different to or different from, that kind of thing. Which are not really,
yeah, this is
yeah, you know, they're not really, it's not really grammar. I think of prepositions also as collocations, really. I mean, it's a function of vocabulary, really. So then I think you have that, and then in the classroom, students will take that same principle with them, and they will say, "Oh, my grammar is terrible." So they'll tell their teacher their grammar is terrible, but what they mean by that is that they don't have enough language to express themselves. That is how I think of it. That they really mean. And just as it's very unusual for people to say about native speakers, "Oh, his words are terrible," or "his vocabulary is terrible." Students don't tend to say that about themselves either. And so what then that perpetuates is a view that the teacher then takes this on thing. They mean grammar. They take it to mean literally grammar, the grammar I teach in my class. And so they think that's what's most important. But for the student, my experience, I know there's a question later about the how you change students' perspectives. Actually, I very, very, very rarely have anybody question what happens in the classroom, because actually what they're getting is just lots of language. And I'm helping them to say lots of things they're trying to say. And so that's what they take from the classroom. They're getting lots of language, and that's the thing which will improve their current level.
Mm-hmm.
And then so all of that then follows through. If you take publishers then will respond to what teachers say. I mean, I think publishers are conservative. There is a kind of thing that they're trying to sell to the most people possible. But I think some of the criticism of coursebook and publishers forgets that they're actually listening to teachers. You know, they're responding to what teachers want. They will go to us, and I see it through the readers who read our material. So when you're writing, you'll often send off your material. You'll give an idea of some task, and the response is the conservative view of teachers often. And so it's very, very difficult to move on, because something which appears different, you have to explain it. There's no sales staff don't have time to explain it to the teachers. The teachers, sometimes training courses have trained them on more conservative things. So suddenly, also the training courses emphasize grammar as well. So then they kind of come, well, when faced with something a bit different, it can be a bit confusing for them.
Yeah.
And so it's just a very, very slow process, that change. I think it is changing. I mean, I think what you are seeing, I mean, you see it in Roadmap, which I would say is not a lexical approach at all.
Okay. I haven't seen it yet.
No, but what's interesting about it is it's taking that idea of outcomes, of thinking about what students want to say, and taking that kind of idea of a task, final task, and working backwards to it to try and match some language. I would say it still ends up perhaps more on the side of that grammar plus words, but it's still, the principle of having a communicative goal like the CFR kind of goals that we talk about, that is having an influence. I think where people haven't quite got to still is the impact, the reality that As soon as you start thinking about, well, what is it you actually want to say, most of the time what you actually want to say involves lots of different grammar, lots of words which don't fit into a lexical set. And to enable to teach that, you actually kind of have to change our mindset on some of the other things that we do in the classroom.
So it's a slow process.
It is. It is. You know, I think it's changing slowly, and I think a lot of people are, you know, moving towards that kind of view of language. Yeah, I think it's.
Yeah, well, you know, you started with what people mean with grammar, yeah, and I think that in Russia, people, well, I mean, general public, when they think about English, they immediately think about tenses and how terribly difficult tenses are.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the center of their learning of English.
Yeah.
To try to differentiate between, I don't know, past simple and present perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the one thing we can teach them is, you know, in terms of persuading them to a different point of view, is just reiterating the point that any meaning, whether it's grammar or words, is quite fuzzy. It's, you know, in a way, it's the smallest part of it. We can teach. I mean, we can tell a rule. I mean, most grammar rules of tenses are probably a sentence long. There's not really much to say about them. It's just that in the process of speaking and encountering it, you know, it's all to do with how they work with the other vocab. You don't have the vocab, you don't know the word, so then you have to use a different word, and then that sounds wrong with that grammar. You know, it becomes a kind of, you know, it's just a, yeah.
Okay, and so what do you think about the idea of teaching lexically without course books? And what do you think about dogma approach?
Yeah, I mean, when we wrote Teaching Lexically, I actually had in mind that it being a kind of complement to dogma and task-based learning and those kinds of views of language, because I think we do basically share a fundamental thing in common, which is that you want the students to be able to talk about something which is relevant to them, or to do something in English which is relevant to them. And that's the kind of the goal. And okay, obviously in task-based and dogma, it's the process as well. The thing I've always felt about it, because I mean, essentially a lot of what we do with, when we started writing innovations particularly, a lot of that stuff came out of teaching dogma lessons. You know, I was teaching students in England. They would come in, we would have these conversations, I would enable them, and I would notice things like gaps in their knowledge, but I'd also notice patterns about how the conversations worked and stuff like that. And I tried to then put those into material. And I think that's the problem is, and the difficulty for anybody doing these kinds of approaches, is that there's a lot of cognitive effort on the part of the teacher to do it well. Because essentially what you have to do in the class, you have to hear what the students are saying, hear what's wrong with it, think about how you can change that into the correct English. Ideally then give them why. I mean, you know, if we're going to help them notice it, or give them other patterns or other vocabulary which is relevant to it. And you've all got to do that in kind of like a matter of moments. So it's hard. And
it is.
Yeah, and you know, that's for a native. I mean, I think it's hard for all teachers. You know, there's you know, I constantly write stupid things on the board. You know, things which I wouldn't necessarily say, but you know, in the moment, I'm just trying to think of something, how to say it, or I can't remember how to say it. So my view was there were two parts of it. That firstly, as I think Scott says in his book, you can predict kind of what students are going to say in conversations. So there are, it's chunks and phrases, and if you want, I mean, even from a grammar plus words, you can think of it in that way. So if you can predict it, I don't see the issue with teaching some of that before they say it.
Like pre-teach.
Yeah, essentially pre-teaching it. And in pre-teaching it, actually, you can also have conversations around the vocabulary and language, which is actually slightly different to the final goal that you're aiming at. So there can be kind of spontaneous teaching around that area as well. And that seems to be the fundamental difference, that I would say that there's a value in kind of structuring or providing some pre-teaching of before these tasks. The dogma person or the TBL to less, maybe, they're basically saying you can, they kind of get into a situation where they say you can only learn it if you do the activity and the teaching is post the activity. I just don't see that myself. I think also there's two other things about it. One is that they are very focused on, they developed out of thinking about grammar, not words. So I think, I mean, we all know as language learners that you can learn a shed load of words and their basic meanings. Obviously, it doesn't mean that you can use them. That happens through the class and through the activities and through the thing. But you can learn some basic meanings which can take you somewhere. Yeah. So I think that is a value. And then the last thing is, my issue would be that if you think that the actual learning really takes place over time from repeated encounters and exposure, it's obviously possible for that to happen through your tasks and your conversations, but it's again a lot of work for the teacher to manipulate and to ensure that the students are getting that revision and recycling and revisiting of stuff. And that, you know, that is where the course book can help, if you're writing it from the perspective of doing that. I mean, actually, most course books aren't written from that perspective, so that's right. You know, that's why I would say ours is slightly different. You know, it's on the surface, it will look very similar to lots of them, but when you get into the actual language, I think often you'll find that it tends to be a bit more natural and reflective of how we speak and how we do it, but also you see this language reappearing in conversations and listenings in whatever as you go along, and the tasks, you know, also obviously give opportunities for further recycling of that.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about revision and recycling just a bit later.
Okay.
So it's good that you mentioned that. Yeah, I totally agree here that, you know, just giving this proper feedback with ideas on how to improve and how to say differently. Well, if you ask me, that's the hardest part of the lesson for me always. Yes. Because it's unpredictable and you have to think on the spot a lot and react on the spot. Yeah. And that's. I mean, what I would say is you can get better at it. And for me, thinking about how you explore the language within exercises in course books is actually one way you can get better at being spontaneous in responding to students. So, I mean, essentially, I see it with Hugh and myself, that actually quite often we repeat things which we've taught before. They appear, if you came to our class, you would think, wow, that's all very spontaneous. It's actually something we've done like 3 or 4 times before. And it's just a kind of little section of a lesson, which could have been in a course book, could have been from a dogma type lesson, but it's been repeated and we've found it successful. Students are interested and we do it again. And so that's it's a kind of developing those processes, I suppose. You and he are often referred now as the torch bearers of the
Yeah.
lexical approach
As I say,
after
I'm not
Michael
not
Lewis.
yeah, not entirely sure about that myself, but there you go.
Yeah, well, after Michael Lewis's retirement, yeah, so.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, in what way what you do within the framework of the lexical approach is different from what Michael Lewis did and from, for example, Stephen Dave Willis did?
Um, it's quite tricky to say because I think fundamentally the difference between us and Michael is that we were teachers and he wasn't, or not at that time. I mean, basically he was writing from a purely theoretical and philosophical point of view. He was running a publishing company.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we've and I guess similar story with David, actually, Dave Willis, and they're similar. I mean, I know they taught as well, but they were academics essentially. So I think where we came from was we were basically just normal teachers. We read these things. They chimed with a certain truth to us, and we started trying to put them into practice within our classes. And I suppose one of the things which has been a criticism is this issue about syllabusing. And so essentially we started, well, how would that look like? I mean, in a way, the course books are what we tried to do with the lexical approach is kind of an idea of syllabusing, organizing it in particular ways. And a lot of that will features then there are exercises, lots of exercises which we do are basically originally in the lexical approach or teaching collocation. Some of them have evolved as well. I mean, what I do now a bit more in terms of listening is working more with these kind of phrases, but how they might sound in fast and slow speech. I don't know if you're familiar with Richard Caldwell, speech in speech in action, I think it's called. Mm-hmm. And showing how words change their shape within sound shapes, he calls them. So there are things which I've picked up on as we went along, which I then think that there's a lot of stuff on bottom-up skills, for example. Now seems to be it's coming more or less to the mainstream that really skills are to do with automaticity of recognizing how words sound in and recognize them in writing as well. That this is the kind of key thing to this kind of repeated exposure to them, so you can process them more automatically. And so
listening, decoding.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's basically decoding words essentially, and words in combination with other words and how they sound differently. So that chimes very closely with lexical approach, because basically what you're saying is, well, we need to learn these words always, hear them more often together, hear them in different speeds. That might be a slight variation since Michael was around. Same with reading, perhaps, there's this idea of speed reading. So you might kind of take a word list of a text, speed read it first, but again, rather than single words, we might have little pairs of words or chunks of words or whatever. So there are things which have been developing as we go along. And then there is stuff which is just, I don't know, it's just the way I was trained. I mean, I'm not entirely free from my salsa training.
Not entirely free.
It's
a nice way of putting it.
We're the product of our training and backgrounds. So I do a lot of basically just chatting to people and then just listening to them I mean, very close to what Dogme would be, basically.
Yeah.
It's just I integrate it with materials sometimes.
Okay, so to finish off this like theoretical part, a question from a subscriber. How do you feel about the lexical approach changing and developing over time? And do you think at some point it may blend in with some other existing approaches and there will be a method that incorporates all the best methods?
Yeah, so I chose this this question. This was the competition winner, wasn't it?
Yeah, we're gonna say about it later as well. Yeah, we're gonna congratulate.
Yeah. The points about this for me is I think that's what we're doing already. They're basically, you know, essentially you've got a lexical view of language. This is this kind of combinations of words, patterns coming out words, and learning over time from constant exposure. And once you take those kind of basic principles, there are lots of other possibilities. You know, I think Dogme, task-based learning, yes, we could do that. You could have a class. You could start your class with a conversation. The way I would adapt it in terms of teaching lexically is, you know, I would think about the things that they might want to say before, even though I don't teach them, I would think about them before they do their task, so that I'm somehow primed to hear these things when they do try and say them. So I at least have something to follow up on after the class, after they're speaking. And usually that would be a mixture of things I thought of and things which they actually did say. I mean, it's quite difficult hearing students sometimes in a class. So, I mean, you know, it's not just the process of trying to interpret what they're trying to say, it's actually physically hearing. So there are things you can do within a Dogme, for example, which I would say lexical approach applies to. I like the idea of drills. Okay.
Okay.
I would go with drills of things which you would actually say. So it might be, you know, common questions. I think there's a lot to be said for, you know, just drilling. Where are you from? But for example, it would be drilling it, taking into account these factors that I've talked about already, might be drilling it fast and slow or at different speeds so that they hear these different ones, maybe differentiating with another common question. You know, it could be drilling, say you take, would you like something? I mean, what we've looked at, would you like some more? Would you like a coffee? You can predict the kind of typical responses, like, no, I've just had one. No, thanks, I'm fine. We could just drill some of those typical responses, and we could have some kind of prompts from the would you like and what you're instead of this grammaticalized drill where you'd be saying yes I would, no I wouldn't, you'd be drilling and repeating the phrases. You know, so I think there's lots of room for and translation. I mean, there's lots of grammar translation. You know, I think in the first edition of Outcomes we had these kind of by two-way translation things. So we would give kind of 5 examples of a pattern. Say it could be I don't know, sentences with even or something like that. I don't know. They're trying to show a pattern, or expects was a good one. So I didn't expect it to be so busy. I didn't expect there to be such a lot of people. So these are kind of have typical patterns associated with them. You get them to translate them into their own language. You then cover it. You ask them to translate back. You compare them. But it's all working with things you might say, and kind of used language is what I think Lewis called it sometimes. You know,
you have it in the second edition, but it's like a separate worksheet.
That's right. Yeah, it's on a worksheet now because basically conservative teachers, some didn't like it. They don't like the use of translation in the classroom. So
Okay.
So we put it somewhere else.
So it's
But
optional activity.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, I mean, I just think if you understand it as fundamentally to be about a view of language, and secondary as how that language is acquired over time, then there are lots of possibilities. We I thought of an alternative title for teaching lexically would be two teachers principles and their eclectic activities for putting into practice those principles. But obviously that doesn't fit onto one page, so you kind of it's not a very snappy title. So
That's a funny one.
teaching lexically it is, and essentially I would imagine lots of people will be teaching. In the end, we'll teach how they want to teach.